Ragnar Lothbrok stands at the crossroads of myth and history, a figure shaped as much by oral tradition as by fragmentary historical memory. Emerging from the world of 9th century Scandinavia, Ragnar is remembered not simply as a warrior, but as a symbol of the Viking Age itself, a period defined by exploration, raiding, settlement, and cultural transformation. The sagas portray him as a man driven by ambition and curiosity, restless in a homeland of narrow fjords and limited resources, looking outward toward the wealth and prestige of foreign shores. Whether Ragnar was a single historical individual or a composite of several Viking leaders, his legend captures the mindset of an era in which fame was won through daring deeds and remembered through stories carried across generations. According to tradition, Ragnar's early life was marked by a hunger for distinction. He is often depicted as challenging established authority, not content to inherit power, but determined to earn it through action. The sagas emphasize his cleverness as much as his strength. A leader who understood when to strike and when to wait, when to inspire loyalty and when to instill fear. His famous epithet, Lothbrok, meaning shaggy breeches, is itself a reminder of how legend works, linking heroic identity to vivid, almost theatrical detail. Through marriage alliances and personal charisma, Ragnar gathered followers who were willing to cross unknown seas with him, trusting not only his sword arm, but his judgment. Ragnar's raids form the dramatic core of his story and reflect the broader Viking expansion into Western Europe. Tales place him along the coasts and rivers of England and Francia, where longships appeared with terrifying suddenness, exploiting political fragmentation and weak defenses. These expeditions were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations aimed at wealth, prestige, and leverage. Ragnar is portrayed as learning from each campaign, adapting Viking tactics to increasingly fortified targets. In the sagas, his attack on Paris stands as a defining moment, illustrating both Viking military ingenuity and the vulnerability of even powerful kingdoms to mobile, disciplined raiders. Equally important to Ragnar's legacy is his role as a father for his sons, such as Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Ubbe, carry his story forward into a more firmly documented historical landscape. In saga tradition, Ragnar's death becomes the catalyst for a new phase of Viking warfare. Captured by an enemy king and executed in a snake pit, he faces death with defiance, proclaiming that his sons will avenge him. This scene, whether historical or symbolic, marks a shift from individual raiding to large-scale campaigns, as the so-called Great Heathen Army descends upon England. Ragnar's end thus serves not as a conclusion, but as a turning point, linking legend to the geopolitical upheavals of the late 9th century. Ragnar Lothbrok is inseparable from the wider story of how the Vikings emerged from the margins of Europe to become a transformative force between the 8th and 10th centuries. His legend reflects a world in motion. Scandinavian societies were changing under pressure from population growth, limited arable land, and expanding trade networks. In this environment, seafaring was not merely a skill, but a necessity, and warfare was closely tied to honor, leadership, and survival. Ragnar's story captures this moment of transition, when local chieftains began to think beyond their homelands and envision power measured across seas rather than valleys and fjords. The rise of the Vikings was rooted in innovation as much as aggression. Advances in shipbuilding, especially the development of fast, shallow draft longships, made it possible to travel vast distances by both sea and river. Ragnar is portrayed in the sagas as one of the leaders who fully grasped the strategic implications of this technology. He represents the shift from small coastal raids to deeper, more ambitious expeditions that penetrated the heart of rival kingdoms. These journeys were not acts of desperation, but calculated ventures that blended exploration, trade, and violence. Under leaders like Ragnar, Viking bands evolved into flexible military forces capable of adapting quickly to unfamiliar political and military landscapes. Ragnar's campaigns, as described in tradition, illustrate how Viking raiding fit into the political realities of early medieval Europe. Kingdoms such as those in England and Francia were often divided by internal rivalries, succession disputes, and weak central authority. Ragnar's raids exploited these fractures, turning speed and surprise into decisive advantages. The sagas emphasize that such attacks were rarely mindless destruction. They were demonstrations of power meant to extract tribute, negotiate advantage, or establish long-term influence. In this sense, Ragnar symbolizes a broader Viking strategy that blended intimidation with diplomacy, laying the groundwork for later settlements and alliances. Central to the rise of the Vikings was the creation of enduring reputations, and Ragnar's legend served precisely this purpose. Fame was a form of power, spreading through stories carried by merchants, warriors, and poets. Ragnar's supposed victories amplified the fear and respect surrounding Scandinavian warriors, making later Viking incursions more effective even before the first ship appeared on the horizon. His role as a father in saga tradition further reinforces this idea. His sons inherit not only weapons and followers, but a name that commands attention. Their subsequent campaigns reflect how Viking activity evolved from episodic raiding into sustained military and political presence across Europe. Ragnar Lothbrok is often introduced in legend not as a born king, but as a man rooted in the soil of Scandinavia, a farmer shaped by hard land, harsh seasons, and the quiet discipline of rural life. Early Viking society was deeply agrarian, and survival depended on patience, endurance, and cooperation with kin. In this world, farming was not separate from warfare. It trained the body, hardened the will, and taught the rhythms of planning and risk. Ragnar's transformation begins here, in a society where ambition simmered beneath daily labor, and where the limits of the land pushed restless men to look beyond the horizon. The leap from farmer to warrior was driven by opportunity as much as desire. As Scandinavian communities grew and resources became strained, young leaders sought wealth and status elsewhere. Ragnar's story reflects this shift. He is portrayed as a man who learned to command not through inherited authority, but through personal ability, organizing crews, navigating dangerous waters, and returning with spoils that elevated his standing. Each successful voyage expanded his reputation, drawing followers who believed that his luck, courage, and judgment could lead them to prosperity. These early expeditions mark the moment when subsistence gave way to ambition, and when local leadership began to evolve into something more expansive and dangerous. Ragnar's rise as a conqueror mirrors the maturation of Viking warfare itself. What began as seasonal raiding grew into sustained campaigns that targeted wealthy and politically unstable regions of Europe. The sagas depict Ragnar as a leader who understood timing and psychology, striking when kingdoms were divided, retreating when resistance hardened, and returning stronger each time. He was not merely a brute force commander, but a figure who embodied the Viking blend of adaptability and aggression. Through these campaigns, Ragnar crossed the threshold from raider to ruler, transforming mobility into power and violence into authority. As his influence expanded, Ragnar's identity shifted from individual adventurer to dynastic figure. Leadership now meant maintaining loyalty, rewarding followers, and projecting strength across generations. His household became a center of power, and his sons were raised in a culture that expected conquest as a continuation of legacy. In saga tradition, Ragnar's later years are marked by both confidence and vulnerability. Success breeds pride, and pride invites challenge. His eventual defeat and death are not portrayed as failure, but as the inevitable cost of a life spent pushing boundaries. The farmer who once worked the land now stands as a symbol whose fate reshapes the ambitions of others. Ragnar Lothbrok is remembered not only for his deeds in life, but for the way his story moves steadily toward a carefully imagined death. In the Viking world, existence was framed by an unbreakable bond between honor, fate, and the afterlife. To live well was important, but to die well was essential. Valhalla, the great hall of the slain, was not a distant spiritual abstraction, but a tangible goal, promised to those who faced danger without fear and met death with defiance. Ragnar's legend unfolds with this belief at its core, shaping his choices and defining the meaning of his victories and failures alike. From early in his rise, Ragnar is portrayed as a man acutely aware of destiny. Viking culture did not see fate as something to escape, but something to confront head-on. Courage lay in meeting one's destined end with dignity. Ragnar's campaigns reflect this worldview. He repeatedly places himself in situations where survival is uncertain, not out of recklessness alone, but because risk was the pathway to lasting fame. Every raid, every battle carried the possibility of death, and therefore the possibility of glory beyond life. In the sagas, Ragnar's confidence grows not from invincibility, but from acceptance. If death comes, it comes on his terms, with weapon in hand and name remembered. As Ragnar's reputation expands, so does the weight of expectation surrounding him. He is no longer merely fighting for wealth or leadership, but for legacy. In Viking belief, Valhalla was not granted to kings because they ruled, but to warriors because they proved themselves worthy. Ragnar's later campaigns are therefore charged with a deeper intensity. He seeks not comfort or security, but final affirmation. The sagas emphasize moments where prudence gives way to pride, suggesting that Ragnar knowingly walks closer to danger. This is not presented as foolishness, but as the logic of a warrior culture in which a peaceful end carried no honor, and survival without glory was its own kind of failure. Ragnar's death, captured in the iconic image of the snake pit, is the culmination of this worldview. Whether historical or symbolic, the scene distills the Viking ideal of heroic defiance. Stripped of power, surrounded by enemies, Ragnar refuses submission. His final words, boasting of his deeds and foretelling vengeance, are not pleas for mercy, but declarations of worth. In saga tradition, this moment seals his passage to Valhalla. He does not fear the venom or the darkness. Instead, he welcomes the hall of Odin, where fallen warriors feast, fight, and prepare for the final battle of the gods. Death becomes transformation, not defeat. Ragnar Lothbrok emerges in the sources as a warrior who did not simply raid kingdoms, but openly tested the limits of royal power itself. In the early medieval world, kingship was fragile, often dependent on personal authority, military success, and the perception of divine favor. Ragnar's legend unfolds against this backdrop of unstable thrones and divided realms. From the perspective of European rulers, he was not merely another sea raider, but a disruptive force who exposed the weaknesses of kings who ruled by inheritance rather than strength. His story reflects a moment when Viking leaders began to see themselves as equals, or even superiors, to the crowned heads of Christian Europe. Ragnar's challenge to kings was not ideological, but practical. He understood that royal authority relied heavily on control of resources, cities, and symbols of power. By striking monasteries, ports, and fortified towns, he attacked not just wealth, but legitimacy. The sagas portray him as deliberately provoking rulers, daring them to respond, measuring their resolve and capacity. When kings failed to stop him, their authority eroded further, both in the eyes of their own subjects and among rival elites. Ragnar's campaigns thus functioned as political tests, revealing which kingdoms could defend themselves and which survived only by paying tribute or negotiating from weakness. What sets Ragnar apart in legend is his refusal to remain a peripheral threat. Rather than retreating after plunder, he repeatedly returned, forcing kings into humiliating cycles of defense and ransom. These encounters elevated Ragnar from raider to rival ruler, a man whose power was recognized even by those he opposed. The sagas suggest that kings came to fear not only his ships, but his reputation, which preceded him and destabilized regions before battle was joined. In this way, Ragnar weaponized fame itself, turning memory and rumor into tools of domination that crossed borders faster than any army. As his influence grew, Ragnar's confrontations took on a more personal dimension. Kings were no longer distant figures, but named adversaries, embodiments of the order he defied. His eventual capture, often depicted as the result of overconfidence or betrayal, restores momentary balance to the royal world, yet it comes at a cost. Even in defeat, Ragnar refuses submission. His death is framed not as the triumph of lawful authority, but as a spark that ignites further upheaval. The vengeance of his sons, unleashed upon the kingdoms that killed him, suggests that royal power could punish an individual, but not the forces he had set in motion. Ragnar Lothbrok occupies a place where violence, ambition, and destiny are inseparable, a figure shaped by a world that understood life as a contest measured in blood and memory. The Viking Age was not merely an era of raids, but a culture structured around honor, reputation, and survival in a harsh northern environment. From this setting emerges Ragnar's story, one that does not soften its brutality. Bloodshed was not an aberration, but a language of power, a way to assert presence in a world where weakness invited destruction. Ragnar's legend reflects this reality, portraying a man who accepted violence as both a tool and a price, fully aware that glory was earned only through risk. Ragnar's rise is framed by constant confrontation against rival warriors, foreign armies, and the limits imposed by geography and society. Each campaign demanded sacrifice, and each victory was paid for with lives lost, both his own followers and his enemies. The sagas emphasize that glory did not come cheaply. It was carved out through endurance and repeated exposure to death. Ragnar's leadership rested on his willingness to share danger with his men, standing at the front rather than ruling from safety. In doing so, he embodied a warrior ideal in which authority flowed from action. Bloodshed bound his followers to him, not just through fear, but through shared experience and collective survival. Yet glory, in the Viking understanding, extended beyond the battlefield. It was sustained through stories, poetry, and remembrance. Ragnar's deeds were magnified as they traveled across seas and generations, transforming practical victories into legendary exploits. This process elevated him beyond the status of a successful raider, turning him into a symbol of what a warrior could achieve by defying limits. Glory became a form of immortality, ensuring that even as bodies fell, names endured. Ragnar's growing fame carried its own momentum, drawing allies and enemies alike, and pushing him toward ever greater challenges that demanded even higher stakes. Underlying Ragnar's pursuit of blood and glory is the persistent presence of fate. Viking culture viewed destiny as fixed yet meaningful, something to be faced rather than avoided. Ragnar's later actions in the sagas suggest a man increasingly conscious of his destined end. Success bred confidence, and confidence shaded into defiance, not just of enemies, but of fortune itself. His final downfall is portrayed not as an accident, but as the fulfillment of a path long chosen. Captured and condemned, Ragnar confronts death without retreat, affirming through words and attitude that his life has met the standards his culture demanded. Ragnar Lothbrok lives in the space where history fades into legend, carried forward not by written chronicles, but by saga, song, and collective memory. The world that produced his story was one in which reputation mattered as much as territory, and where a man's deeds were expected to outlive his body. The saga of Ragnar unfolds within this oral tradition, shaped by generations who saw in him a reflection of their own values: courage in the face of danger, ambition without apology, and acceptance of fate as an inescapable force. Whether he was one man or many blended into a single heroic figure, Ragnar became a narrative vessel through which the Viking Age explained itself. The saga begins with a man driven by restlessness rather than inheritance. Ragnar is not defined by a stable throne or peaceful rule, but by movement across seas, rivers, and borders. His early exploits emphasize initiative and daring, qualities prized in a society where leadership had to be proven repeatedly. Each voyage strengthens his name, and each return confirms his ability to bring wealth and honor to those who follow him. The saga tradition stresses that Ragnar's authority grows organically, forged through shared risk and success rather than imposed by law. In this way, his rise mirrors the broader transformation of Scandinavian society as it turned outward and embraced expansion. As the saga progresses, Ragnar becomes more than a raider. He becomes a challenger of established order. His encounters with foreign rulers are framed as clashes between different visions of power. Kings who rely on walls, armies, and divine sanction find themselves unsettled by a leader whose strength lies in mobility, surprise, and reputation. The saga does not portray these conflicts as simple victories or defeats, but as tests of resolve and legitimacy. Ragnar's repeated appearances on distant shores create a sense of inevitability, suggesting that no kingdom, however wealthy or sacred, is beyond reach. His presence alone reshapes political realities long before battles are fought. Central to the saga is the theme of legacy, embodied most clearly in Ragnar's sons. As his story nears its end, the focus begins to shift from individual achievement to generational consequence. Ragnar's downfall is dramatic and symbolic, marked by capture and death rather than quiet decline. Yet the saga refuses to end in silence. His final defiance transforms personal defeat into collective momentum as his sons take up his name and purpose. In this narrative structure, Ragnar's death is not closure but ignition, reinforcing the idea that a true Viking legacy continues through action rather than memory alone. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok endures because it offers more than adventure. It provides meaning. It explains how violence, ambition, loyalty, and fate were understood in the Viking world, and why these values held such power. Ragnar is remembered not because he conquered the most land, but because his life followed a narrative arc that resonated deeply with his culture. He lived boldly, faced death without submission, and ensured that his name would be spoken long after his ships were gone. In this way, the saga preserves not just a man, but the spirit of an age that measured greatness by how fiercely one embraced both life and destiny. Ragnar Lothbrok is inseparable from the age of raids that reshaped Europe between the late 8th and 9th centuries, a period when Scandinavian warriors transformed seaborne violence into a sustained historical force. This era did not begin as an organized conquest, but as a series of probing strikes, testing coastlines, river routes, and political responses. Ragnar's legend captures this experimental phase when ambition, opportunity, and maritime skill converged. His story reflects a world in which speed mattered more than numbers, reputation more than territory, and daring leadership could tilt the balance against kingdoms far richer and more populous than those of the north. The Viking Age of raids was made possible by technology and environment. Long ships, light yet resilient, allowed crews to cross open seas and then slip deep inland along rivers, appearing where defenses were weakest. Ragnar is portrayed as a leader who understood this strategic revolution early. Raiding under his command was not aimless plunder, but a method of intelligence gathering as much as wealth acquisition. Each expedition revealed which regions paid quickly, which resisted fiercely, and which could be exploited repeatedly. In this sense, Ragnar symbolizes the learning curve of Viking warfare, as small bands evolved into disciplined forces capable of coordinating timing, logistics, and psychological shock. Ragnar's raids, as remembered in tradition, highlight how Viking violence intersected with European instability. Many kingdoms were fractured by succession disputes, local rivalries, and limited central control. Monasteries and trading towns, rich yet lightly defended, became early targets not because of religious hatred, but because they embodied concentrated wealth and weak protection. Ragnar's repeated successes demonstrate how raiding thrived on political fragmentation. Each victory amplified fear and rumor, making subsequent attacks easier by undermining confidence before ships even arrived. The raid, therefore, was not just a military action, but a destabilizing force that rippled through societies far beyond the battlefield. As the raiding culture matured, figures like Ragnar began to blur the line between hit-and-run violence and sustained pressure. Raids became seasonal rhythms, returning to the same regions with increasing ambition. Tribute, negotiation, and intimidation joined swords and fire as tools of influence. Ragnar's legend reflects this transition, portraying a leader who could extract submission without permanent occupation, yet still reshape power relations. This phase laid the groundwork for later developments, when raiding fleets grew into armies and temporary camps evolved into lasting settlements. The Age of Raids was thus not an endpoint, but a gateway to deeper Viking involvement in European politics. Ragnar Lothbrok is remembered as a figure shaped not by peace or inheritance, but by repeated exposure to conflict. His legend emerges from a world where battle was the primary measure of worth, and leadership was proven through action rather than title. In the Viking Age, warfare was not an interruption of life, but one of its defining structures. shaping social bonds, political authority, and personal identity. Ragnar's story reflects this reality. He is portrayed as a man whose reputation was hammered into form through confrontation, each clash refining his status and expanding the reach of his name across seas and generations. The early stages of Ragnar's rise emphasize combat as a testing ground rather than a final goal. Battles served as moments of selection, separating leaders from followers and survivors from the forgotten. Ragnar's ability to endure, adapt, and return stronger after each encounter marked him as more than a successful raider. He learned from defeat as much as from victory, refining tactics, choosing targets more carefully, and understanding the psychology of fear. In the sagas, warfare becomes a process of education, and Ragnar stands out as a figure who mastered its lessons faster than most, turning experience into authority. As his legend grows, Ragnar's battles take on wider significance. They are no longer isolated struggles for loot or survival, but events that challenge established powers. Each successful confrontation weakens the confidence of kings and magnifies Ragnar's standing among both allies and enemies. Warfare, in this sense, becomes performative. Victory is not only about physical domination, but about reshaping perceptions of power. Ragnar's name begins to travel ahead of him, carried by rumor and fear, ensuring that the psychological impact of his battles often preceded the clash of weapons. His legend is thus forged as much in expectation as in bloodshed. The later phase of Ragnar's story is marked by escalation. With fame comes risk, and with risk comes inevitability. Battles grow more ambitious, opposition more determined. Ragnar is portrayed as increasingly aware that greatness demands a final reckoning. In Viking culture, a life defined by combat could not end quietly. His ultimate defeat and death are framed not as contradictions of his legacy, but as its completion. The legend insists that a warrior forged in battle must be claimed by it, and that the measure of Ragnar's life lies in how fully he embraced this truth. Ragnar Lothbrok is often remembered for his victories, yet his legend gains real depth when viewed through the cost of achieving and maintaining power in the Viking Age. Leadership in early Scandinavian society was never secure. It depended on constant success, the loyalty of armed followers, and the ability to distribute wealth won through risk. Power was not inherited in peace, but sustained through action, and failure carried immediate consequences. Ragnar's rise reflects this unstable reality. Each step toward dominance demanded sacrifice, forcing him to balance ambition with danger in a world where authority could vanish as quickly as it was earned. As Ragnar's influence expanded, so too did the burdens that came with command. Power required continual demonstration. A leader who hesitated or avoided risk invited challenge from rivals within his own ranks as much as from foreign enemies. The sagas portray Ragnar as a man compelled to keep moving, raiding, and testing himself because stagnation was indistinguishable from weakness. Every expedition placed lives, ships, and reputation at stake. Success enriched his household and strengthened loyalty, but failure threatened collapse. The price of power was therefore perpetual exposure to danger, leaving no space for lasting security or retreat. Ragnar's authority also carried a personal cost. Leadership isolated him from the ordinary bonds of community that defined earlier stages of his life. Decisions made for strategic gain often resulted in loss. Trusted warriors killed, alliances strained, and families fractured by ambition. The saga tradition hints at a growing distance between Ragnar and those around him as his reputation grew. Power demanded not only courage but emotional endurance, as each victory increased expectations and narrowed the margin for error. In this way, Ragnar's story reflects a broader truth of the Viking Age. Greatness separated leaders from the very society that had elevated them. In his later years, the price of power becomes unmistakably clear. Confidence, shaped by years of success, begins to harden into defiance. Ragnar's final campaigns are marked by a sense of inevitability, as though he understands that sustained dominance must eventually be tested beyond endurance. His capture and death represent the ultimate cost paid by a man who refused moderation. The saga does not frame this end as tragic miscalculation alone, but as the natural conclusion of a life built on risk. Power carried him upward, but it also narrowed his path until retreat was no longer possible. Ragnar Lothbrok's legend endures because it confronts power without illusion. His story does not present authority as a reward freely enjoyed, but as a condition purchased through sacrifice and ultimately paid for in full. The Viking world admired strength, but it also understood its cost. Ragnar stands as a reminder that power, once taken, demands everything in return: loyalty, safety, and finally life itself. In this balance between triumph and loss, his story captures the harsh realism beneath Viking glory, revealing why his name survives not only as a conqueror's, but as a cautionary emblem of the price of command.